Imagine a Tuesday morning that never begins. You wake up, reach for your phone, and find it dead. Not out of battery, but unresponsive. You walk to your computer, and the screen remains a void. You look out your window, and the traffic lights are frozen in a chaotic, flickering rhythm. The global banking system has seized. The power grid is stuttering. The supply chains that feed cities have simply evaporated. In the span of a single hour, the modern world has reverted to the 19th century. This isn't the plot of a dystopian blockbuster. It is a mathematical certainty that keeps the most powerful people on Earth awake at night. And at the center of this fragility is not a government, a military, or an ideology. It is a piece of silicon, smaller than a postage stamp, etched with billions of microscopic pathways. We live in an era where we believe technology is infinite. We talk about the cloud as if it were a weightless, ethereal realm floating above our heads. But the cloud has a physical address, and that address is under siege. For the last 3 decades, the entire trajectory of human progress has been funneled into a single vulnerable bottleneck. A 100-mile stretch of water separates the island of Taiwan from the mainland of China. Within that narrow corridor lies the most important piece of real estate in the history of civilization. It is the home of TSMC, the foundry that manufactures the brains of almost every smartphone, fighter jet, supercomputer, and AI model on the planet. If you own an iPhone, you are carrying a piece of Taiwan in your pocket. If you use ChatGPT, you are accessing the processing power of chips forged in the shadow of the Taiwan Strait. We have built our entire digital existence on a house of cards, trusting that the political status quo would hold forever. But the status quo is fracturing. This brings us to one of the most bizarre and high-stakes gambles in corporate history. Apple, the most valuable company in the world, a titan of design and vertical integration, has begun a secret, desperate pivot toward a rival that many had written off as a relic of a dying era: Intel. On the surface, this makes no sense. For years, Apple spent billions to distance itself from Intel, moving to its own proprietary silicon to gain speed, efficiency, and control. Why would the master of the ecosystem suddenly look back toward the very company it spent a decade trying to outrun? The answer isn't about better performance. It isn't about software optimization. It is about survival. Apple and the tech giants of the West are realizing that the era of globalization is ending. The digital iron curtain is descending, and the supply chains we took for granted are becoming leverage in a new, cold game of geopolitical chess. Apple's quiet outreach to Intel is not just a business deal. It is a hedge against a catastrophe that would dwarf any financial crisis in history. We are witnessing the frantic scramble of a superpower trying to rebuild its industrial base before the clock runs out. But as we peel back the layers of this silent countdown, we have to ask the uncomfortable question: is it already too late? Can Intel, a company struggling with its own internal demons, actually be the shield that protects the future of global technology? Or is this just a desperate distraction from an inevitable collapse that no amount of silicon can prevent? The world is holding its breath. The chips will be placed on the board.
If you look at the floor of a modern data center, you are looking at the nervous system of the human race. Every email, every bank transaction, every piece of artificial intelligence, and every stealth maneuver by a global superpower relies on a physical object no larger than a fingernail. We call them semiconductors, but in the corridors of power, they are simply called the new oil. And just like oil, he who controls the flow controls the world. To understand why Apple is currently dancing on the edge of a geopolitical blade, we have to stop looking at the logo on the back of your phone and start looking at the island of Taiwan. Specifically, we have to look at one company, TSMC. For decades, the world operated under a comfortable illusion. We believed that technology was a globalized, borderless miracle. We believed that if a company in Cupertino designed a chip, a factory in a friendly nation would build it, and the global market would keep the peace. But that illusion has shattered. TSMC now manufactures over 90% of the world's most advanced microchips. They are the undisputed king of silicon. And Apple? Apple is their crown jewel. When Tim Cook made the decision to move Apple's entire ecosystem onto their own proprietary silicon, he wasn't just making a business pivot. He was making a high-stakes gamble on a single point of failure. If the machines at TSMC stop, the heartbeat of the global economy skips. If the supply chain in the Taiwan Strait is severed, the digital world does not just slow down, it goes dark. This is the digital Iron Curtain. It is not made of barbed wire or concrete walls. It is a barrier constructed of ultraviolet light. Extreme ultraviolet lithography machines that cost hundreds of millions of dollars apiece, and a level of engineering precision that borders on the impossible. This is a barrier that no other nation, not even the United States or China, has been able to fully replicate. We are living in a reality where the entire future of modern civilization is tethered to a handful of facilities located on an island that sits at the center of the world's most volatile geopolitical flashpoint. Think about the sheer vulnerability of this arrangement. The most advanced consumer tech giant in history has outsourced its very soul to a geography that is effectively a powder keg. If you want to understand why Washington is suddenly obsessed with chip manufacturing, why billions in subsidies are being funneled into the American desert, and why Intel is being courted with the desperation of a drowning man, you have to realize one thing. The era of efficiency is over. The era of survival has begun. We have spent 30 years optimizing for cost, ignoring the risks of a centralized supply chain. We built a world where everything is interconnected, but we forgot to build a backup plan. Now, as the shadow of a new global Cold War lengthens, the tech giants are realizing that their supply chain isn't just a logistical problem, it is a national security crisis. Apple's dependence on TSMC is a masterclass in efficiency that has become a paradox of fragility. They have built the most powerful devices in human history, but those devices are held hostage by the stability of the South China Sea. Every time a ship passes through those waters, every time a fighter jet breaches an airspace, every time a trade war heats up, the stock price of every major tech company in the world shudders. The digital Iron Curtain is already descending. It is a quiet, invisible divide between those who control the fabrication of the future and those who are forced to beg for access to it. We are entering a new age where the most important resource on Earth isn't gold or lithium or oil. It is the ability to etch logic onto sand.
And as we move deeper into this decade, we are about to find out exactly what happens when the most powerful company on Earth realizes that it can no longer guarantee its own future. The deal with Intel isn't just a corporate strategy. It is a desperate, frantic attempt to build a lifeboat before the tide turns. But is it already too late? The answer lies in the secrets hidden behind the closed doors of the world's most guarded factories.
The history of technology is often written in the language of benchmarks, clock speeds, and consumer convenience. We are told that we upgrade because we want more power, more efficiency, and a smoother experience. But beneath the polished veneer of the glass and aluminum devices we carry every day, a much darker, much more calculated game is being played. This isn't about how fast your video renders or how quickly your browser loads. This is about the fundamental architecture of our civilization. When we look at the strange, seemingly counterintuitive alliance between Apple and Intel, we aren't looking at a collaboration born of convenience. We are looking at an insurance policy, a multi-billion-dollar, high-stakes bet on digital survival in an era where the global supply chain is no longer a reliable highway, but a potential minefield. For decades, the tech industry operated on a simple, naive assumption that the world was flat, that trade was frictionless, and that the semiconductor industry would always be a global, collaborative effort. Apple thrived on this. They designed in California, sourced components from every corner of the map, and assembled in the heart of Asia.
It was a masterpiece of logistics, a lean, mean, globalized machine. But the world has changed. The geopolitical climate has curdled. The fragile web of dependencies that sustains the modern economy is now being tugged at by the gravitational pull of great power competition. Apple knows something that most people are only just starting to grasp. They know that if the geopolitical Iron Curtain descends, if the trade routes, the shipping lanes, or the fragile peace in the Taiwan Strait were to be disrupted, the very foundation of their empire would evaporate overnight. If Apple relies solely on a single point of failure in a volatile region, they aren't just a tech company. They are a house of cards waiting for a gust of wind. This is why the Intel partnership exists. It isn't because Intel is currently winning the race for the fastest silicon. It is because Intel represents the only viable path to domestic, sovereign control over the most critical resource of the 21st century. By pouring resources into Intel's foundry business, Apple is effectively subsidizing the construction of a fortress. They are paying to bring the factory home, not because it is cheaper, but because it is the only way to ensure that, in a worst-case scenario, the lights don't go out. Think of it as a hedge against the end of globalization as we know it. Intel is currently a wounded giant, struggling to regain its footing, but it possesses something that no amount of money can buy overnight: infrastructure, expertise, and a footprint on American soil. Apple is essentially betting that they can nurse this giant back to health, not for the sake of the PC market, but for the sake of their own continuity. If the world fractures, if the digital Iron Curtain falls, Apple needs a backup plan that doesn't rely on a trans-Pacific voyage. This strategy reveals a profound shift in how the titans of Silicon Valley view the world. The era of pure optimization is over. We have entered the era of resilience. The companies that will survive the coming decades are not necessarily the ones with the best marketing or the sleekest designs. They are the ones that have successfully de-risked their existence. But this brings us to a haunting question. If Apple has to go to such lengths, if they have to prop up a struggling rival just to keep the supply chain within reach, what does that tell us about the fragility of our own digital lives? We live in a world where our banking, our communication, our personal histories, and our infrastructure are all pinned to chips that are currently at the center of a global geopolitical tug.
The Apple-Intel deal is a signal. It is a quiet, corporate acknowledgement that the stability we took for granted for 30 years was an anomaly, not the status quo. As we move forward, the question is no longer just about what our devices can do for us. It is about whether those devices will still exist if the global order decides to turn its back on us. We are all passengers on a ship that is currently reinforcing its hull, not because it expects a storm, but because it knows that the ocean itself is changing. And as we peel back the layers of this partnership, we begin to see that the future of technology is no longer being written by engineers in a lab, but by diplomats and strategists in the shadows, fighting to keep the digital world from going dark. To understand why Apple is willing to gamble its future on Intel, you have to look past the sleek aluminum casings and the minimalist interfaces of your MacBook. You have to look at the ground beneath our feet. We are currently living through the most significant industrial bottleneck in human history. There is a terrifying truth that keeps CEOs and national security advisors awake at night. The entire modern world, our banking systems, our power grids, our defense infrastructure, and every single smartphone in your pocket relies on a single fragile point of failure. It is a tiny island off the coast of China where a company called TSMC operates. TSMC is the undisputed king of the Silicon Age. But in a world growing increasingly unstable, relying on a single node in a geopolitical flashpoint is not just a risk. It is a structural flaw in the foundation of global civilization. Building a modern semiconductor foundry is quite possibly the most difficult engineering feat humanity has ever attempted. It is not just about building a factory. It is about constructing a cathedral of physics.
Inside these facilities, the environment must be cleaner than a surgical operating room by a factor of 1,000. A single speck of dust, invisible to the naked eye, is a catastrophic failure that ruins millions of dollars of silicon. You are dealing with extreme ultraviolet lithography, machines that use light to etch patterns smaller than a human virus. These machines are the most complex devices ever built, requiring thousands of suppliers and a supply chain that spans every continent. Most companies try to build a foundry and fail. They underestimate the sheer crushing weight of the physics involved. They underestimate the decades of institutional knowledge required to master the yield, the percentage of chips that actually work. This is why the industry has consolidated. This is why everyone went to TSMC. They were the only ones who could make it work at scale. But then there was Intel. For years, the narrative was that Intel was a dying giant, a legacy player trapped in its own bureaucracy. But if you look past the stock prices and the quarterly earnings, you find something that no other company on Earth possesses: the infrastructure, the raw industrial capability, and the decades of hardened experience in high-volume manufacturing. Intel is the only entity left with the sheer physical footprint to act as a backup for the digital world. They are the only ones with the deep-pocketed history of building the fortress. When we talk about the impossible task of domesticating the chip supply chain, we aren't talking about starting from scratch. We are talking about retrofitting a titan. The deal between Apple and Intel isn't just a business arrangement. It is a desperate insurance policy for the digital age. It represents a pivot toward a world where efficiency is no longer the only metric. In the New World Order, resilience is the ultimate currency. If the world's supply lines were to fracture tomorrow, TSMC would be a target, not a supplier. In that scenario, the ability to manufacture the world's most advanced processors on Western soil becomes the difference between a functioning society and a return to the Dark Ages. Intel is attempting to do the impossible, to turn a failing legacy giant into the world's foundry. It is a gamble of trillions of dollars and the collective willpower of thousands of engineers. If they succeed, they don't just save their company. They secure the digital iron curtain that protects the Western economy. If they fail, the blueprint for our future remains locked behind a single, vulnerable door. We are watching a high-stakes game of industrial survival. It is a race against time, physics, and the shifting tides of global power.
But as we look toward the horizon, one thing becomes clear. The era of cheap, reliable, globalized silicon is coming to an end. We are entering the era of the fortress, and the walls are being built right now, one layer of silicon at a time. The slow finality. The question is no longer whether we can build these chips, but whether we can do it fast enough to keep the world from going dark. We are standing at the precipice of a new industrial age, yet we are building it on the most fragile foundation in human history. If you look at a map of the world's most advanced semiconductor fabrication plants, you aren't just looking at factories. You are looking at the modern equivalent of the Library of Alexandria, stored in buildings that are more fortified than any central bank. The terrifying reality is that the entire trajectory of human progress, our artificial intelligence, our global defense systems, our medical breakthroughs, and our daily connectivity is currently held hostage by a handful of locations on this planet. We have spent decades globalizing our supply chains, believing that the world would remain stable enough to keep these fragile links connected. But the era of global cooperation is receding, replaced by a digital iron curtain. This is why the Apple-Intel partnership is so much more than a corporate move. It is a desperate, calculated attempt to reclaim sovereignty over the very building blocks of the future. By betting on Intel's foundry business, Apple isn't just buying chips, they are buying insurance against a geopolitical catastrophe. They are attempting to ensure that when the next wave of global instability hits, they won't be left with nothing but empty assembly lines. We have reached a point where the manufacturing of the most advanced processors has become a strategic bottleneck for the entire species. The complexity of these chips has grown so exponential that only 2 or 3 entities on Earth can actually produce them at scale.
If one of these hubs goes dark, it isn't just a quarterly earnings miss for a tech company. It is a total paralysis of the technological infrastructure that keeps the modern world breathing. We have to ask ourselves, are we witnessing a masterstroke of long-term strategy? Is this the moment where the titans of industry finally realized that they could no longer rely on the status quo and chose to rebuild the foundations of their own empires? Or is this, in truth, a sign that the era of global tech dominance is already on the brink of collapse? Perhaps the real story isn't that Apple and Intel are saving the world. Perhaps the real story is that they are the first to realize that the world as we knew it, the world of seamless, borderless, and infinite supply, is already gone. We are now in the business of survival. The chips that power your life are no longer just commodities. They are the new oil, the new gold, and the new currency of power. And as the walls of the digital Iron Curtain continue to rise, the companies that control the last remaining factories on Earth will be the ones who write the history of the next century. We are no longer just consumers of technology. We are witnesses to a high-stakes gamble, where the prize is the future itself. And the cost of losing is a return to a dark age we thought we had outpaced. The question is no longer whether your phone will get faster or your computer more powerful. The question is whether we have enough time to build a new world before the old one decides to turn the lights off for good. Whether this deal is a salvation or a swan song, one thing is certain. The era of blind optimism in global tech is over. We are now playing